So before I bring these speakers up, I just want to present to you kind of a little scenario. So once upon a time, there was a patient named Pat who had an unanticipated outcome. Questions were asked. Caregivers tended to keep to themselves, minimalized and rationalized while avoiding too much emotion. There was a comment of, "I know how you feel," or "I apologize for whatever happened." Many caregivers are afraid to apologize or discuss at all. No incidents were reported. The family starts to ask questions. Provider denial sets in. Fear and finger pointing cause a provider to contact their insurance carrier. They're told to talk to no one about this, not the patient, partners, colleagues. Provider distress starts to set in. Isolation. Pat and the patient's family questions go unanswered. Providers start to experience self-doubt, disappointment, perhaps shame. Pat is seeking an explanation, a sincere apology, and assurances that changes have been made to prevent harm from being done to someone else. Pat now tries to navigate the traditional litigation system that can be very difficult to access, isn't a reliable mechanism for sorting meritorious from non-meritorious claims, and results in wildly varying damages awards for similar injuries. Fear has prompted the medical community to rely almost exclusively on a legal system that does not serve their needs and is expensive financially and emotionally. 2 to 4 years go by after depositions. Nothing has been done to investigate, analyze, and possibly learn from this towards quality improvement. Pat and the family are psychologically wounded by the inability to obtain facts in an empathetic manner. With no institutional mechanisms in place to aid providers in the grieving process, they turn to dysfunctional ways to protect themselves, and this distress escalates in the face of a malpractice suit. Once formed and often strong relationships are forever broken, regardless of any trial or settlement outcomes, and many times you now have a second victim, the care providers. There is a better way for patients and providers to proactively address patient and family needs for ongoing transparency, for timely resolution, for quality improvement through system solutions and disseminated learning, and focusing on just culture system and human factors, and for maintaining relationships between patients, families, and caregivers, even when an unanticipated outcome occurs. This conference is about introducing and or better educating you on that better way. Candor, communication, and optimal resolution is a process to proactive approach to respond in a timely, thorough, and just way to unexpected patient harm events that can be physical, emotional, or financial. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tim McDonald and Mr. Bruce Lampert.
Thanks, Mike. Bruce, I think we're done. I think he just pretty much explained all of what that was awesome, Mike. Thank you. And it's so great to be back in Iowa. As you mentioned, I was here in 2013, but just prior to that, the last time I had been here was right around the time that the world was looking at Des Moines, which is when the sextuplets were born. And I was actually invited by my great friend, Jim Hopkins, pediatric surgeon, who I did a lot of anesthesia for in Chicago before he came back to Des Moines. And it was really great to be here, and it's really awesome, Jim, to see you again. Talk about somebody who epitomized candor 20 years ago. Jim and his wife are a couple that really do epitomize that. So it's really awesome to be here with you all. So this is again, the disclosure side that we put up there. You heard from Mike kind of where we are with that. And now we're going to talk about, briefly, Bruce and I getting into the real kind of nuts and bolts of Candor, communication and optimal resolution, and our work with this beginning in 2006 up until today. One of the things we're most excited about, we're actually working with over 115 hospitals in Candor implementation in over 9 states right now. And we'll talk a little bit about, that kind of process and how it's been. But as you can see from this slide, and Mike, I think it gets to, when words and actions matter most, it's not just talking the talk, it's walking the walk. And we're going to speak today a little bit about doing that. And one of the slides that I like to use, one of the quotes I like to use, is from a person who I believe, if ever there was somebody who talked the talk and walked the walk, it was Mother Teresa. But it gets to a lot of what Mike just talked about, which is a lack of transparency results in distrust and a deep sense of insecurity. Honesty and transparency make you vulnerable. Be honest and transparent anyway. Trust, honest, humility, transparency, and accountability are the building blocks of a positive reputation, and they are the building blocks of candor. As Mike mentioned, one of the jobs that I have right now is working at MedStar in the Center for Open and Honest Communication. I have been working with them over the last 4 or 5 years in candor implementation, and to that end, I have a video of one of the most profound cases they had of horrible patient harm. You know, we talk about unexpected adverse outcomes. Patients often describe these not as unexpected adverse outcomes or adverse events, but as catastrophes, as plane crashes. And part of the approach to candor is how do we recognize that and respond as quickly as possible in the way that Mike spoke to. So I'm going to show you this video now, and we're going to go through a lot of the steps of what it took for MedStar to get there.
In the summer of 2013, I began to experience a shooting pain in my right arm. I was having a difficult time holding a golf club. I was losing the strength in my right hand. I went and had an appointment with my internist who recommended therapy, and it really didn't have the effect that I wanted. Dr. Torlani recommended surgery. Things didn't go as planned. The 2.5-hour surgery took about 5 hours.
I've been practicing medicine, practicing orthopedic spine surgery for 13 years. So when I was doing my training, we were taught, maybe not too different than the airline industry, if there is something that's not typical happening in the operating room, first pause, and then second, call a trusted colleague and tell them about what you're experiencing and tell them what your plan is to get out of whatever the challenge is that you're in. Then mention it and talk to the family about it real time so that everybody is in the loop.
And I was thinking, oh, he's finished. He just wants to tell me that they're done and he's moving on and, you know, he'll be out shortly. And instead it turned out that he said things weren't going very well. Dr. Tortolani explained to me what was happening. He gave me 2 options, that he could either abort the surgery or he could continue with his new plan. And he wanted my permission to continue, and I said yes. I know it was very difficult for him, and I was very thankful that he did come out and talk to me, but I could tell for him it was very hard because he had known Jack for a while.
When I woke up in the recovery room that evening, I learned that I was paralyzed from the neck down. I had always been a fighter, and I told him, I said, let's get the show on the road, let's figure out what we're going to do and get it started.
The difficulty that I have had with this gets to just trying to internalize something that was really tough, but their family has made it so much easier for me. And how dedicated they have been to his recovery has made it so much easier. And the fact that they did not push me away as their doctor has made it incredibly better in terms of maintaining a relationship.
He went way beyond apologizing, way beyond saying that he was sorry.
I mentioned it to our administration to let them know about this incident, just to make sure that we were doing everything we possibly could to support them. And they just brought it to a whole nother level of support for their family.
I don't remember exactly when I got the call from the risk manager who's on site at the local hospital, but when he called me, the question was, how do we deal with this? What should we do? When you work in an organization where the directive is to do the right thing, the answers are really easy. Tell them basically anything they need is what we're here to give them. We have to support them.
I was shocked personally that the hospital did say something happened on our watch, we want to be responsible for it, and we want to help you in any way we can.
Don't worry about it, we'll take care of it. And they did.
The first week Jack was in the hospital, we were supposed to be transferred to Good Sam Rehab, and we found out that our insurance was not going to pay for acute rehab, and immediately the discharge planner told us that MedStar had decided that they were going to pick up the tab for that, not to worry about it, that we were going to transfer him and get him the help he needed.
I went in the hospital as a patient, and then I became a victim, and that's not right. As a victim, the early intervention allows the victim/patient to get on with their life a little quicker.
If we're there in the very beginning, we can make sure they have home health aid. They have somebody in the house to take care of them. They have attendants if they need to, somebody to take care of their needs. That all can be done in the very beginning. In the old traditional way, I'm just looking at picking up the pieces after everything has been broken. In the new way, we're looking at taking those pieces and making sure they're melded together to get the patient the best outcome possible.
It's really made it much easier for me to just keep doing what I do and what I love to do.
MedStar did it all. They did emotional support, they did physical support, and they did monetary support. I think all of those things together are what's going to make it a success.
It was one less thing I had to worry about. It allowed me to concentrate on getting better. That just made life a lot easier for me.
So Jack and Teresa are amazing, and we do a lot of work with them. In fact, 2 weeks ago, despite his disabilities, Jack and Teresa came out to California, to Huntington Beach, where we had a huge workshop on Candor, particularly the resolution component of it. And Jack and Teresa were there, and the group they're working with is a group Bruce and I've done a ton with, which is the Beta Healthcare Group. And I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they are the largest med mal insurer in California. They have over 200 entities that they work with. They have put their Candor program together as an insurance company, and they give a 10% premium discount to hospitals that fully hardwire it. And so they had 20 hospitals opt in to go through the training as they've done for the last year. But they don't call their program Candor, they call it HEART, Beta Heart, where the H stands for healing, the E is empathy, the A is accountability, the R is resolution, and the T is trust. And it's amazing to be working with that kind of group and these organizations. And Jack and Teresa, again, were fantastic in working with we have about 400 people in the audience from all these different hospitals figuring out what are some of the ways that this is important. And we often talk about why we are here. You know, the IOM report came out in 1999 and talked about a lot of the preventable harm that happens. And Macri just published this from Hopkins last year, talking about how preventable medical harm is now the third leading cause of death. And we haven't gotten as safer as we should have gotten in the last many years. And that's why, Mike, I was glad to hear you say one of the key components of what you're trying to do here in Iowa is learn from these events to make sure it doesn't happen to the next person. And one of my really good friends, Rosemary Gibson, published the book, The Wall of Silence, where she describes the hell that patients and families go through when there's no communication after harm. Not necessarily when mistakes happen, just when bad things happen. And we know that this wall of silence goes up around everybody, like Mike talked about. It's built up around the caregivers, it's built up around the patients and families. It really is one of the things where everybody, unfortunately, ends up in isolation. And we have the case to illustrate it. Now, as Jerry Lewis Jenkins knows, she actually knows this patient. She and I have talked about it for years when we've been at different conferences. I found out to my surprise that she actually knew her. But this was the COO of Michael Reese Hospital when I worked there. And I also worked at the University of Illinois. She came to the U of I to have a plastic surgery procedure done. And her pre-op blood test showed a white count of 1,000. We did not see it. We did not pick it up. Those of us in anesthesia, surgery, we completely missed this white count. And she had surgery, and post-op, she has a repeat CBC that shows a white count of 500, which is now a critical test result. That got called to Mary RN at a time when we did not have a Mary RN on that floor. So we're not quite sure who it went to. We didn't act on it then, and 6 weeks later, she dies from a treatable leukemia. Early 2000s. So we go to our CMO and our CEO when we find out about it from Northwestern, because that's where she died, and said, hey, we'd like to reach out to her fiance. And they said, no way. Traditional. Don't say anything, and let's just hope this goes away. Of course, that's not what happened. We ended up getting sued. We delayed, we denied, and we defended for 4 years. I think we ended up spending about $275,000 in defense costs. We settled for millions in Cook County, and we really learned little and suffered immensely. And it really gets to what you talk about, which is, culture eats strategy for breakfast every morning. And so we were then, at that time, really suffering as a hospital, as caregivers. And I don't know, Jerry, if you want to share a little bit about the family, because I know you talked to them after that. And it's so painful to hear that, but that it did become the case that inspired us to change the way that we did things in 2000s. Do you want to share that just a little bit? Because it's so rare I get to run into you anymore, and it was so surprised that you knew her so well.
Thank you, Tim. I will tell you that this was my dearest friend. I actually had the honor and the heart-wrenching opportunity to actually utilize her at her funeral. Karen was a nurse. She was a loving mother, an incredible woman who was dedicated to her patients and to her patient families, and she arose in healthcare and became an executive in healthcare because she actually brought compassion in everything she did. And when this happened to her, about a month and a half before she was to get married, when we were all going to gather and have a wonderful celebration, this was a devastating experience. We all gathered when she died. Her family, she was one of 8 children from Cleveland. And her fiance actually was an attorney. And we all gathered, and I remember so well that as we talked about her, one of the things that kept coming up was, why won't anybody talk about what happened? Of all the people in the world, someone who dedicated her entire life to patients and families, and we can't get an answer. This is a tremendous, tremendous honor to have Karen's legacy live on with Candor. It is finally, we are at the point where we are all talking about doing the right things for the right reasons. I will just say one other thing is I've heard Tim talk about this, and I actually work at COPIC, and we are a patient safety organization, and every day we get up thinking about patients and families. I would just encourage all of you to engage in this, embrace it. We're talking about humans, and we're talking about the human spirit. So I thank all of you for what you're doing, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart and Karen's family for having this legacy go on.
Thank you. Just great comments. I did not expect to see you here today. When I did see you, I thought, oh my gosh, there's a reason, why we set this up and for you to be here. So yeah, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and it is a clicker that is a systems issue that So anyway, the impact of the wall of silence, as Mike talked about, I mean, the wall of silence, or I would argue, delay, deny, and defend destroys lives. So here's the other side. So Jared just talked about the family side. Here is an amazing book that was actually written a really long time ago by a psychiatrist at U of I. Her name is Sarah Charles. And she had a patient who tried to commit suicide who ended up a paraplegic. And she ends up getting sued. And she just describes so perfectly the hell that clinicians go through when they're put into this, don't talk about anything and just wait for sort of the lawsuit to happen. So these are her words here. My first feelings after being charged with medical malpractice were being utterly alone. I felt isolated from my colleagues and patients. And I understand what I experienced is common for people who go through that. And she goes on to just really describe what it's like to be put into that isolated box after patient harm occurs. Swallowed up her life, demanded constant attention and study. All the way down to she felt her integrity as a person and physician had been damaged and might be permanently lost. I mean, this is, if you were to look up the symptoms of burnout, you would clearly see many of the things that she talks about being the things we now see in physician burnout. Which, as you can see there, the hopelessness, the lack of empathy, the inability to feel happy, the anxiousness, the fear, the anger. We know now from the data we've been looking at over the last few years that when people are involved in these harm events and we don't find a way to predict or prevent the second victim syndrome that happens to that, it leads to incredible amounts of burnout. And in fact, since you guys passed the legislation here in Iowa, you can look and see that these unkind acts of kindness causes collateral damage. And you can begin to see the fact that this has led to this huge increase, as we'll see, in the amount of burnout that physicians are particularly feeling. So after the case involving Karen, we worked with the University of Michigan, and we came up with these principles with Rick Bruthman to say this is what we're going to do. It becomes the fundamental underpinning of any Candor program. We will provide effective communication following all serious harm events. We will apologize and fairly and rapidly resolve cases when we all agree that our care was bad. We will learn from our mistakes, and as importantly, we will hug and love patients and families and caregivers when this stuff happens. And so, how did we go about shattering the wall of silence? We had to first address the barriers and then look at the benefits. So as you sit there right now, what are the barriers that possibly your legislation helped overcome, but what are the barriers out there to being really open and honest with ourselves and with patients and families when bad stuff happens? From your perspective, from those of you in the audience here, what are some of the fears? What are the barriers? Litigation. Why is litigation so bad? What's bad about it? What are the bad things about it? So reputation, for sure, which I know killed us in the situation related to Karen, because we know the community was talking about the fact that we had not spoken up to one of our very own. Reputation, what are other barriers? Oh, it's horrible for both parties. It's expensive, it's anxiety-provoking. I mean, I can tell you, and having worked with a lot of surgeons in the past, I could tell when surgeons were about to have a deposition in the next week or two, because they were so much more irritable, they were so much preoccupied when they do that. So totally agree, it's horrible for everybody and very expensive. Other fears or barriers that people have, which really Bruce hopefully is going to get into in his part. Other barriers to being fully open and honest. What's that? Being less than perfect, very huge issue, particularly for those of us who in kindergarten did super well. And then in grade school, we were awesome. And in high school, we were valedictorians. And then we go to college and we get great grades, and we finally go into medical school and get to do amazing residencies, being told every step along the way that we really don't make many mistakes. And so it's very hard to deal with that. But you mentioned over here, another comment. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because in so many organizations that does tend to be one of the primary barriers, which is you don't know what happened. You know your part, You don't know the other parts. It's actually this uncertainty of the process. How do I go about having that conversation when I only have 10% of it? And there's no standardized process to get all that information and guide it. And so, again, we'll talk a little bit about that. But we wouldn't be here, you wouldn't have passed legislation here if there weren't benefits to it. What are the benefits to being open and honest and transparent and humble and sharing what it is we know? And Mike mentioned some of them. What are some of the benefits? With whom? Relationship building with whom?
Within, not only with the peers who are involved, but with patients, families, communities.
Absolutely. Glad to hear you say that. In Karen's case, you can imagine how much the anesthesiologists and the surgeons cannibalized each other as you go through the litigation, looking like this. It was anesthesia's fault. It was nursing's fault. It was the surgeon's fault. So had we approached that way, a lot of those relationships, which were damaged forever, forever, would have been handled much better and would have prevented that. So absolutely, building and trust, I would say, is what builds in there. Trust with patients and families, and also trust in the colleagues. In the back. Yeah, so I don't know if all of you heard what she said, but her comment was, and actually I have something to say about that in a specific hospital in Arizona, that if the physician has talked to the patient about this potential complication, then it is no longer an unexpected adverse event and you don't have to talk about it. And actually there is a policy in a hospital. We do a lot of gap analyses before we go into a hospital. One of the hospitals we were in 3 weeks ago, their policy actually says that. We will disclose unanticipated patient outcomes. However, if this outcome is something that was discussed during the informed consent process, it is no longer considered unanticipated. So even though death might happen, rarely in a hernia case in a child, we have no obligation to come and talk to the family about that if in fact this infant dies post-op, because we talked about it. Might have been a 1 in a million, but we talked about it. So the benefits we have found far more outweigh what the barriers were, and we learned that then with a whole lot of people we were working with throughout the country. And so, we ended up putting together initially an approach to try to reach out to patients and families when our care is bad, and this is how we initially designed it. This is a Sorry Works program, which, as we know, sorry doesn't work. And we learned this a lot from patients and families. So here's how we designed it, which is initially, event happens. If there's harm, you look into it. If care was bad, you then reach out and apologize. What was so wrong about this? When we showed this to patient advocates, they really, really criticized us for designing something that they thought was really, really not getting to the root of it. What's missing from this slide, from this approach? So there's no empathy up there at all, right? A little bit of apology there. When does it happen? Once you've determined whether care is appropriate or not. I don't know about your organizations, but that takes a while. So what's missing up here? So there's zero immediate contact with the patients or the family, and this is the crucial piece that helped us design the 7 pillars. We learned from patients and families that every hour that goes by without effective communication following harm is another harm. Every hour that goes by without effective communication, not about apology, it's not about saying we made mistakes, it's just every hour that goes by without an explanation, without reaching out, without saying, trust us, we'll stay in contact with you, is another harm. So that's missing. What else is missing? Again, one of the key things that Mike mentioned. Yeah. Well, exactly. So there's nothing in here where you can see the connection to process redesign, the rest of that sort of stuff. What else is missing, which is huge, that we'll be getting into as well? No care for the caregiver. There's nothing in here about doing that. And then the other part that we identified, and we learned the really hard way, is managing the billing issue. We did a wrong-sided neurosurgery case once at the University of Illinois. We billed the patient, both pro fees and hospital fees. When they didn't pay, we sent them to collections. And we ended up on the front page of the Chicago Sun-Times. So none of that was in there. So it took us a year and a half to build this. We hardwired it and ultimately developed what many of you all know as the 7 pillars, which is this is the diagram in the paper we wrote, where when stuff happens, even when there's no harm, you want it reported so you can do process improvement on the near misses. The second, patient, is a term that we often use, the error investigation, the hold the bills, the whole piece, and then creating this patient communication consult service, where Bruce is going to talk about how we go into any organization, identify the super communicators who are absolutely the most critical people in helping coach or have those initial conversations. We'll share a little bit about how incredibly powerful that is for doing that. And then, of course, supporting and then when it does turn out, and we all agree our care was bad, how do we remediate and resolve that very quickly doing that? So we had a lot of good data there, as we talked about, in 2012, 2013. We got more funding to put together the Candor Toolkit, which is at the AHRQ website now, pretty much focusing on these key domains. The part we're here to really talk about is this response and communication piece, this need to immediately respond to support the caregivers, but also patients and families, and how do you really put that sort of thing together. So the paradigm shift. Reporting, it used to be delayed to now the expectation is immediate. When we left the University of Illinois in 2013, we had really engaged the learners and the resident physicians. When we left, of our occurrence reports that we had at U of I, 2,000 came from resident physicians and medical students. When 3 years prior, fewer than 10 came from them, a huge piece. Communication, moving from delay, deny, and defend to immediate and ongoing conversations. Event review, moving from shame, blame, and train to human factors, process redesign. Care for the caregiver, from suffering and isolation to immediate support. And resolution, moving from make them fight for it to early offer in appropriate situations. So Bruce is now, I'm going to have him come up and talk about the communication component of it and how he has really helped us understand this communication part. And I will tell you, with a lot of stuff he's going to share with you, I think at the end of the day, he actually saved my marriage. And I think you'll see why in a lot of the things he's going to get to and communicate.
Is this the
Thanks,
part where
Bruce.
I say I'm divorced, Tim?
Yes, it is. Yep. So you got to walk the walk, Bruce, as well as talk the talk.
Morning, everybody. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today, and thanks to the Iowa Medical Society and to COPIC for making it possible. So we're really happy to be here. So we call this program Candor, Communication and Optimal Resolution. So obviously, it's not a mistake that we designed this acronym the way we did. We think communication is the central feature of these programs. It's the single most important feature in their success, or potentially in their failure if you can't get the communication part right. But not everybody is equally skilled as communicators. We sort of know this intuitively, but there's this phenomenon in psychology where if you survey people and you ask them, rate yourself as a driver, like 80% of people rate themselves as above average drivers, right? It's impossible, it can't be the case. There's the thing like Wobegon, right? That where all the children are above average, but we can't all be. In fact, in communication skill, just as in any other skill, there's some sort of normal distribution of these skills. But in Candor, we need absolutely the best communicators to do these extremely difficult tasks. It turns out we can actually measure these differences in communication skill, and we could do so validly and reliably. And in that way, we can identify the most skillful communicators and put them in leadership positions in a Candor kind of program. So we found that it's critical to use these assessment tools that we have when we go into a hospital so we can identify what we sometimes call these super communicators, the most highly skilled communicators in your organization, and put them in leadership positions. It doesn't mean everyone else in the organization doesn't also have critical roles to play in making Candor work. It just means in terms of leading the communication consult team, you want your very best communicators out front. So this is just a graphical illustration of, like in any skill, you'll see a normal distribution, and I'll show you a distribution of the measurement of communication skill that we've used, and it looks very much like this. So over here on the right-hand side of the distribution, where the highest skill level, we want to identify those people and draw from there to find the leaders in the Candor program.
All right, get to the money shot.
So this is
All right, simulcam's
an
time.
illustration. I don't know if I pause this. Hang on one second. Okay, so this is an illustration from another domain. We may not, in communication, we all like to think of ourselves as good communicators because communication is central to many of our identities. So none of us wants to think, well, I'm a lousy communicator. But the fact is, it's a reality that we won't all be equally skilled. This is easier to see in the domain of athletics. So none of us thinks we're all equally skilled athletically. We're not all equally fast runners or high jumpers. We're not all equally strong. So this is an amusing illustration of this point that I saw on ESPN.
All right, get to the money shots now.
All right, simulcams time. This is when it's always fun, right?
Yeah.
Why don't
Here
we
we go.
start out with perhaps the #1 pick in the draft, Jameis Winston, the quarterback for Florida State, the Heisman Trophy winner. Jameis ran 4.97, Rich.
So these are pro athletes running
Okay.
against Rich Eisen, the
Okay,
ESPN
well, what about
broadcaster.
the #2 quarterback, or maybe the #1 quarterback, Marcus Mariota, who ran the fastest time as a quarterback.
So he gets a
And we gave
10-yard
him
head
bit of a
start.
Head start there.
He's gonna run me down.
See,
Richie
we're
Almo
not
ran.
all
Marcus
equally
ran
skilled.
4.52.
Some of us are that
Richie
broadcaster,
Almo
some of
ran,
us
okay.
are the
You
professional
get a
athlete.
10-yard head
See, I
start
think there's
on
one
this
more here at least.
Kevin White from West Virginia, the wide receiver.
Oh, I have
10
no
yards
shot.
for you, Rich.
I have no shot.
And here comes Kevin.
He jumped.
Now, Kevin did run 4.3.
So you get the point. We're not all equally skilled. It's obvious in the domain of athletics. It's not as obvious in communication, although I think if we scan our lives, we know that there are people in our lives that are just extraordinarily talented communicators, and there are others not so much in terms of their talent. So not only do people differ in their communication skills, but tasks differ in their complexity and in their difficulty. So some communication tasks are very, very easy, and some are much harder. So a classic example of an easy communication task is describe your home or your apartment. If I asked you all to describe your home or apartment, not only would you find it easy, but almost all of you would do it in exactly the same way. You would basically give a virtual tour. You'd say, oh, you come in the front door, and then there's an entry hallway, and to the left is the dining room, and to the right is the living room, and up the stairs, and on the left is the bedroom, and then there's the bathroom. And you would all basically do it the same way. None of you would struggle. None of you would be anxious about this task. On the other hand, if I ask you, where should I point this thing? There we are. To disclose a medical error to a grieving family, this is on the other end of the spectrum of difficulty and complexity. We've given this kind of task to hundreds of people all over the country, and it produces enormous variation. Enormous variation. Some people say stuff like, she'll be fine. Someone will be able to speak to you soon. And this is when the patient's been grievously injured. Others will write these beautiful, sensitive, empathic messages. So disclosure situations are among the most difficult situations you will ever encounter in your life in terms of their emotional complexity, the stakes, the brief time to prepare, and so on. So they're hard for a variety of reasons, which I just began to discuss. There are multiple conflicting goals. When you go in and talk to a family in the aftermath of unexpected harm, you have many, many goals. So let's just quickly identify some of these goals. I once tried to enumerate them. I think I stopped when I enumerated about 40 goals. So what are some of the goals? Here's the family. What are some of the goals you're trying to achieve? You're trying to maintain trust. What else? You're trying to give them information. What else? You want to be supportive. What else? You have to be honest about some of the other goals. These are all kind of patient-centered goals. But what are the other goals you're thinking of when you're going into the situation? That's right. Protect yourself. Protect your own reputation. Minimize the risk to the hospital. Minimize the risk to yourself. Try not to get your friends in trouble. And so on. And so there's a goal of like being completely honest. This is one of our goals. And then there's a goal of paint myself in the best light. These goals may come into conflict if, in fact, I made a mistake in your care. So multiple conflicting goals. Very high level of emotional arousal. We're intensely upset, especially because those first communications, our advice is you talk to the family within an hour of the event occurring. Within an hour of the event, the emotions are still very, very high. Not to mention the uncertainty. And not just your emotions, but the family's emotions, right? The families are grieving or angry or frightened or anxious or all of the above. There's a very high level of ego involvement, meaning there's a lot of your own identity at stake. Someone said before that, we don't want to look bad. We don't want to look less than perfect. There's this great book about the physician's experience of medical error. It's called Medical Error and Medical Narcissism. And it's not talking about pathological narcissism. It's just talking about the tendency in physicians to have so much of their self-image tied up in the idea that they are nearly perfect. And it's so difficult to acknowledge error under those circumstances. It's highly consequential. Your license could be at stake. Millions of dollars could be at stake. It's literally a life or death situation for the patient and family. There may be a career-ending or career-threatening thing for the person doing the communicating. So it's critical to identify the best communicators in your organization to handle these extraordinarily difficult tasks. And of course, we know that communication skill predicts malpractice results. So there are other reasons why we might want to find the best communicators to do this stuff. So we have this approach, you know, years ago, maybe coming up on 10 years ago maybe, Tim and I were talking about this stuff and talking about how important communication was in Candor. And I mentioned to him after a meeting that, you know, Tim, there's this way, because I have a PhD in communication from Urbana. It's okay that we're in here in Iowa. It's all right, even though I went to school in Urbana. There's a way to measure communication skill, a scientifically valid way that's been used for years. And so this is what we've been using in hospitals all across the country. So it allows us to make a preliminary assessment of people's communication skills. It's not a perfect measure, it's not the be-all and end-all, but it's been pretty useful for us. These measures have a long history going back into the 1950s and 1960s in psychology and communication. But to understand what they are, I need to give you a quick course into how communication skill develops. So these measures are based on a theory called constructivism. It says that we represent the world in terms of these bipolar dimensions called constructs, things like good, bad, short, tall, considerate, inconsiderate, generous, stingy, etc. So these bipolar dimensions, we have more or less of these dimensions in our mind. Here's just examples of the kinds of dimensions people have in their minds: kind, cruel, fair, unfair, happy, unhappy, considerate, inconsiderate, etc. There may be very few of these in your mind. There may be very many. And there's this concept, a developmental concept called cognitive complexity, which refers to the degree of differentiation, that means the number of these constructs, the degree of integration, how connected they are to one another, and the degree of abstractness of these constructs. And what we find is developmentally, all these things increase with time. So this theory of constructivism was first developed by researchers who were curious about one thing. They wanted to know, how did communication skill develop from childhood to adulthood? Because obviously, from childhood to adulthood, kids get much better at communicating, and not just in their mastery of the language, but in their mastery of communication itself. And what they found is that as children develop from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, you get this increasing number of constructs, increasing integration of constructs, and increasing abstractness of these dimensions for representing the social world. And as this complexity increases, all sorts of communication skills increase as well. So more constructs means a higher level of competence in the social world, because you basically have a better map of the social world that allows you to navigate it more effectively. Oops. So the quality of your social perception increases as the constructs increase in number, in abstractness, and in integration. And your communication skills increase as the map of the social world gets better. So the best analogy to use here, I think, is that in order to that communication in these complex tasks is like navigation. And in order to navigate the complexity of the social world, we need rich, highly detailed, high-resolution maps of the social world. And what cognitive complexity gives us is having a representation of the social world in terms of these many, many integrated, abstract dimensions. It allows us to navigate the complexity of the social world much more effectively than someone who has only few, relatively concrete, unintegrated dimensions. So to give you another analogy, here's one to help you think about this resolution of the map of the social world. This comes from the Wikipedia page on image resolution. So we knew when we used to buy cameras that sort of a small number of megapixels was bad and a large number of megapixels was good. And the more there were, the more resolution we would have in our photos. So this is just the image example from the Wikipedia page on image resolution. You know, on the left, you have a 1x1 pixel image. And we have 2x2, 5x5, and all the way over here we have a 10,000 pixel image. And obviously, as the resolution increases, we begin to be able to see what's actually in the image. So think, analogously, that some people are operating in the social world and seeing it like this. Right? They don't really see much detail in what's going on in the social world, and hence they're not very effective in the social world. They don't navigate it very effectively. They stumble over things in the social world because their representation is so blurry, whereas others see the social world very clearly and allows them to navigate effectively. Another analogy very quickly is color depth. You ever say about someone or hear said about someone that they're very black and white? That they are unable to see shades of gray. So this is another effective analogy, that this is about color depth from Wikipedia. So here's a 1-bit color, just black and white, only 2 colors. And over here we have 16-bit or 16 million colors. And as color depth increases, we begin to see much more clearly what's in the background, what's in the foreground, all the color. So think of people with high cognitive complexity as seeing the world in high resolution Technicolor, and people with low cognitive complexity as seeing the social world in low resolution black and white. So if you have a high-resolution Technicolor map of the social world, you're going to do much better than if you have this black and white low-res map. So the task we use, which we didn't give to you guys, but when we work with a hospital, we give to these hospitals, is very simple. We say, think of one person you know well and like, and one person you know well and dislike, and in 5 minutes each, describe them in as much detail as you can. Not physically, but their habits, mannerisms, disposition, etc. And then we can score in a variety of ways. And the way we normally score them is just to count up the number of unique constructs they use in each impression. So here's some example of low complexity impressions. These are real impressions that we've got from subjects, participants all around the country. It says, this person is genuine, sincere, taking people at face value, giving them the benefit of the doubt until they prove otherwise, strong work ethic, and team-oriented. This person, so that's 6 constructs if you count them up. Genuine, sincere, taking people at face value, giving them the benefit of the doubt until they prove otherwise, strong work ethic, team-oriented. That's 6. Accepts blame, acknowledges others' achievements, level-headed, trustworthy. That's 4. Good listener. That's only 1. Narcissistic moron. We give them credit for 2. Narcissistic and moron. Those are 2 separate dimensions. So when we do this task, we never know for absolute certain whether people are giving their earnest, sincere, best effort. Because we send this survey to busy people, they may not give it as much effort as they can. So we never know when they produce low complexity impressions, whether they just weren't trying hard, or whether this is really all this guy could think of when he thought of somebody he didn't know, he knew well and disliked. He's just a narcissistic moron. So here's a high complexity impression. This is also produced by a real participant.
In Colorado, Jerry Lewis.
Yeah, this is
the highest we had is when we were in Colorado.
Yeah. So
that is still one of the
there may not be any correlation geographically, but this did come from Colorado. So intelligent, intellectual, relaxed, down-to-earth, approachable, genuine, humble, caring, kind, thoughtful, loving, free-spirited, respectful, hilarious, insightful, discerning, intuitive. Think of how abstract some of these are, right? So narcissistic moron versus discerning, intuitive, composed, deferent, patient, deep, pensive, considerate. It's like a SAT vocabulary test. Multifaceted, complex, worldly, ambitious, dedicated, shy, inspirational, etc., etc. Comforting, faithful, motivational, introspective, pondering, committed, loyal, fun, bohemian. This one always stumped us for a long time. How many people would, if I asked you to do this task, would have used the word bohemian? Right, me neither. So I don't have that construct in my head. So this person, whoever they meet, they're construing them. Bohemian, not so bohemian. We had to go in the thesaurus and look up what's the opposite of bohemian. Anybody know? What would you say? Conformist is what we ended up landing on. Traditional is not bad. So maybe you have this dimension in your head. So here's the distribution of cognitive complexity scores we have from about 450 people. We have more, another several hundred after this, but this is the graph when we made it for this slide. So look, it's a nice bell curve, right? But look at these mutants over here. There is this guy over here who had like 120 constructs. I don't think I could, in the 5 minutes, I often say, you put a gun to my head and say, Bruce, if you can't think of 120 adjectives in 5 minutes, I'm going to blow your head off. I don't think I could do it. I just don't have those dimensions in my head. And I asked this guy afterwards, he identified himself afterwards, he's a physician in Arizona, I think. I said, how did you do it? And he said, well, I was just sitting there doing it, you know? So he somehow, it's sort of like asking Kevin White, the oft-injured wide receiver for the Chicago Bears, who's now on injured reserve again, when he was running the 40-yard dash, it's sort of like asking Kevin, how do you run so fast, Kevin? And he said, I don't know, I just run. They said, the gun goes and I run as fast as I can. And that's how fast I run. And Rich Eisen, the sportscaster, that's how fast he runs. Right? So some of us are just better than others. It doesn't mean all these folks are, which is obviously by definition where most of us are, down here. But if we can identify these folks and put them in leadership roles in Candor, we're going to be more successful. So what are the benefits of high complexity? More organized and integrated impressions of other people, greater ability to recognize other people's feelings, thoughts, motivations, plans, goals, intentions, ability to integrate inconsistent information about other people, to understand their thoughts and feelings, to produce effective messages, that's what really counts, to accurately and completely interpret other people's messages, to structure conversational interactions, to really master communication. So how do things develop over the lifespan? Because this is a lifelong opportunity. If we were to give you this assessment and you scored lower than you wanted, it's not too late. You could read Jane Austen novels, you can look up adjectives and study the thesaurus, and you can start to construe people in these new ways. Because over the lifespan, people develop from few to many constructs, from concrete like tall, short, to abstract like bohemian conformist, from isolated to integrated, so the constructs begin to be connected to one another. And it's a lifelong opportunity for learning and growth. But most importantly, people become more able to produce what we call person-centered messages as they become more complex cognitively. A person-centered message is adapted to the other person's perspective, and especially to their plans, goals, beliefs, intentions, and feelings. And these messages are more effective. So as the person-centeredness of the message increases, other people tend to perceive it as more effective, more comforting, more persuasive, and more kind, etc. So even great communicators need training in Candor-specific tasks, but we want to identify them and give them that specific training. Things like disclosure, resolution, comforting traumatized caregivers, you still need some specific training, even if you're a great communicator already. All these assessments do is identify a kind of raw talent, and training takes the raw talent and refines it with respect to specific tasks. So people differ in their skills. Some of us run fast, some of us run slow. These differences are really obvious when the tasks get hard, like in talking to families after a serious error. The skill differences can be measured in terms of cognitive complexity and other features which I didn't have time to talk about today. These skilled communicators, we should put them in leadership roles in Candor. Although everyone is needed to make Candor successful. I'm just talking about identifying leaders with these assessments, but in order for Candor to work, everyone in the organization has to buy in. So there's scientific references. And I think, do you want me to continue here, Tim, or did you want to take back? Okay. All right. So we ask ourselves, even after we've identified really skillful communicators, we come upon one of these situations where we have to talk to a family after a serious harm has occurred. And we want to know, well, what do patients really need? And this is what we've learned from talking to lots of patient advocates and lots of our colleagues around the country over time. They want the truth. They want to know what actually happened. They need emotional support because they're badly traumatized by this unexpected harm. And they want an ongoing connection and follow-up. And they want some sort of just resolution, whatever that might look like. It's going to depend on the particular circumstances. At the same time, the health professionals, the caregivers, they need coaching in how to talk to patients and families. Even the most gifted communicators among us don't automatically know how to handle these really complex situations that have both incredible emotional complexity and at the same time legal and organizational complexity that needs to be mastered in order to do it well. And they need emotional support. Tim has already talked about the damage that can be done to caregivers in the context of these situations, and up to and including substance abuse, leaving the practice of medicine or nursing, and even suicide in cases where they don't get the emotional support that they need. And it's not an event disclosure, which we do after the event and then it's over. It's this ongoing process. And the question is, how long? Sometimes people ask us, how long should we stay in touch with the family? And the answer is, as long as the family wants to stay in touch. It's really their decision. And so this family, Barb and Bob Melitzo, whose daughter died due to a tragic error at University of Illinois Hospital, an outpatient procedure, we are still in touch with them. It's 10 years after the fact, or approaching 9 years after the fact. They still come out and talk with us in public. So our disclosure process with them has not yet ended. And we anticipate that it won't maybe ever. It'll be ongoing. Not every family will want that. So why do these things fail? Because they do sometimes fail. And we find the most common reason is lack of planning. Before you go in to talk to the family, you have to huddle up. You have to make some basic decisions. You have to anticipate their questions. You have to decide who's going to go in and talk to the family. This is where, even if you don't have the greatest communicators on the team, they will often have critical insights that the skilled communicator needs before they go in and talk to the family. You have to think about who's going to say what, how many people are going to go in. You don't want to overwhelm the family, but you want to be able to answer all their questions. You want to avoid jargon, avoid throwing your colleagues under the bus, and so on. So we have a brief case study we want you to think about. An internist at your hospital admitted a patient yesterday afternoon with asthma. The doctor wrote the patient's admitting orders while she was in a hurry to get home for the evening. The sloppily written 10 units 10U order for 10 units was read by the nurse as 100 units. That's why we're not supposed to use the U anymore. 10 times the patient's normal dose. The patient got 100 units of insulin last night and was found 3 hours later unresponsive with a blood sugar of 35. Resuscitated, transferred to the unit. This morning he's feeling well and transferred back to the floor. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, so what we're going to do, we're going to show you a video, some of you may have seen this, of the physician doing the disclosure with the patient. As you watch this, kind of write down and look at the things you think went really well, and then think of the things that maybe they could have improved. We use this video a lot when we do training at the various organizations to do a pretty short video, but write it down and we'll do a quick debrief on this.
Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson. I came by to see how you're feeling today.
I'm certainly feeling better than I did this morning. I blacked out, and they had to rush me to the intensive care unit. Things seem to have pretty much calmed down for me now. I had no idea I was so sick.
Actually, I wanted to talk with you more about what happened this morning and why you had to go to the intensive care unit. Now, as you know, patients with diabetes can have wide swings in their blood sugar. This morning, your blood sugar dropped all the way down to 35, which was dangerously low. This is why you passed out. Now, fortunately, we were able to get your blood sugar back up to a normal range, so I anticipate things to go smoothly from here on out.
That's sort of odd. My blood sugar has never been that low before. What do you think caused my blood sugar to be so low?
I'm almost positive it was a bad reaction to the insulin you got this morning. Now, we have adjusted your dose somewhat, so this probably won't be a problem in the future.
Bad reaction? What do you mean a bad reaction?
Looking back at your chart, it appears that you got more insulin than you needed. Now, we have a better sense of how much insulin you require, so this isn't likely to happen again.
I have been on the same dose of insulin for the last 4 years. Exactly how much insulin did I get this morning?
It appears the nurse gave you 100 units of insulin rather than the 10 units you normally take. Apparently, there was some kind of miscommunication about what your normal dose was.
What? 100 units? You've got to be kidding me! What kind of a moron would give a patient who usually gets 10 units of insulin 100 units? Well, that could have killed me!
I understand why you're angry, Mr. Thompson, but there's no need to yell.
You'd be yelling too if someone almost killed you. Do you people have any idea what you're doing here?
The good news is the episode that happened this morning didn't cause you any permanent harm. Now, occasionally things like this do happen in the hospital, much as we try to avoid them and prevent them, but what I would really like for us to do, Mr. Thompson, is work together and focus on moving forward and getting your emphysema under better control so that you can go home from the hospital.
I want out now. I don't want to spend another minute in this hospital. No wonder no one would tell me why I had to go to the intensive care unit.
Okay. So what went well? What went well? If you're going to now do some coaching.
Nothing, someone said, Tim.
No, please. So, because the real goal when you do this training and you do it in the hospitals is to be able to coach, look at the things that went well, and then where were there opportunities. But what went well?
Yes.
Eventually.
Yeah.
Eventually did address what happened. Well, that's a question. Show of hands here. How many people think she lied? Yeah, and how do you think she lied?
By omission.
By omission, and what some people say is when she said you had a bad reaction,
Yeah.
that was pretty misleading doing that. But she did eventually get to the point. What other things did she do that were okay, that were good? Yeah. She what?
Yeah.
She had a conversation.
She
She
showed
had
up,
a conversation.
Which is more than happens sometimes.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so she had good eye contact. She didn't get upset when they got upset because it's really hard not to get in that escalating, piece of doing that. Anything else that she did well? She knocked, I think. I think, which was good. So how would you coach her to improve that kind of communication? Again, you use this video, you're now training people in your organization. What might you have advised her of how could she have done this better? Speak plainly. What else?
Sit down.
Sit down.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Nonverbal cues are huge. And when you're up and they're down, we find that has a huge impact on the impression that folks have in the back.
Yes.
I love that. What we'll often do when we have these really difficult ones, we call it sending in a scout. Because as your team's getting ready to go in and have the conversation, it's really good to have somebody go in and get that sense of what do you know, what have you been told, so you don't go in and step all over other people that did that. Great point. Any other advice you would have given her? Yeah. I love that. So when we do this video, or we do that scenario when we have people huddle up, almost every group sends in more than one. And often they'll send in the nurse with the doc or the nurse manager with the doc to prevent that finger pointing, because that was the other thing I think she didn't do very well is she finger pointed. She clearly threw the nurse under the bus when this was a team effort doing that. So I think that's absolutely right. So anyway, these videos, and we have a bunch of these kind of scenarios, are great to use when you do the training from that end. So, you know, what do we all want? You know, we want empathy. And Bruce, do you want to tell a story about your perhaps future wife?
So I was, you know, so I have a PhD in communication. I go around the country teaching people to empathic, but we can't always be perfect, right? In our own behavior. So Dr. Heal Thyself, right? So I was, my girlfriend had written me this, told me about this problem she was having at work, and I crafted this long email, sort of telling her what she should do and telling her how she maybe could think about it. And I thought it was so carefully crafted, and it just went over like a lead balloon. And she wrote me back and she said, I wish you could just be more curious. I wish you had asked some more questions. I wish you had tried to figure out what it was like for me to be going through that. And I thought, oh yeah, those are the things I teach when I teach people how to be empathic.
Well, you know, you can be a good basketball coach and not shoot for snot.
Yeah. So right, people, you know, the curiosity is really critical. We go around the country teaching people how to do this, and we put them in role plays and ask them to do it in front of all their colleagues, and they're often really, you know, worried. What am I going to say? What am I going to say? What am I going to say? And often, if they could just go in there with this attitude of curiosity and ask questions, they can be much more effective than if they go in there thinking they can say something, which like a secret incantation is going to make someone immediately feel better. Tim, you were going to add something.
So how many guys are familiar with Brene Brown? She has, so many of you have. So I just love this quick video that she has on empathy versus sympathy, because I think it gets to the heart, Bruce, of what you mentioned.
Oh, should we talk about this? You want to show this video first?
So this is fascinating. There we go.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Yeah, I just love the work that she does. And the heart at the end, this is why I like that Beta Healthcare calls their process heart, is that Candor is a lot about kindness. It's about love. It is about heart. It's about maintaining trust and maintaining relationships.
And connection.
Immediately. And connections, and how critically important that is. So just to drive this home, and how so often many of us, in our lives communicate, not even realizing how harmful some of the things we say is. There's a woman who had, in Alabama, she had 5 kids. She had a set of twins. One of the twins dies in the hospital post-op, in a pediatric ICU. And a communication back to her when she's talking about how hard it is to cope with this, to one of her friends, sends this text message back to her. She sent me this screenshot that gets to the heart of what Brene Brown's video is, which is the first part's great, right, Bruce? I mean,
Yeah.
you comment on that.
Yeah,
that
that's
message.
beautiful. A mother's heart always longs when she is without her child. That's a nice thing to say. At least you have your others, though, and they need you to be happy. Be happy, okay? Right. So what do you think? How well is this working? What's wrong with this?
Yeah,
Yeah.
at least.
It's sort of terrible, but what's terrible about it? Does anybody think this is good? Want to defend it and say this is a good thing? So what's bad about it? Tries to put a silver lining on it, but why does it seem so insensitive? It minimizes the loss, it's dismissive. It's prescriptive. It tells them how to feel, and it tells them an impossible thing to feel, right? Can you imagine being on the receiving end of this and you think to yourself, oh, my child just died. I should just be happy. Why didn't I think of that?
Right.
Now you've helped me tremendously because I'll just be happy. So what is this person up to? We can imagine this is not a terrible person who sent this message. So why did they say this? They want to fix it. There's an irresistible urge to fix it, which leads to our next video. But why else? What do you think what goal are they accomplishing in saying that? Be happy, okay. What goal are they really accomplishing? Whose needs are they addressing? Their own needs, which is often what we do. These situations we're put into with talking to patients and families, the emotional arousal is so high. These situations are so upsetting to us as well as to the family that we need to soothe ourselves. So often what we say is really aimed at soothing ourselves. It's not other-centered at all. We're not being empathic. We're trying to soothe our own intense emotional arousal, guilt, fear, shame, whatever it is we're feeling, which is why so many times in messages we see people telling the patient and family that the patient will be fine. In spite of everything we tell them, that the patient is not going to be fine. We give them a hypothetical situation where the patient is not going to be fine. And yet they say to patients and families, hypothetically, the patient will be fine. And this is always addressing their own anxiety.
Yeah. So there is, the other key is listening and not trying to fix it. And again, how many of you have seen, this is my all-time, I know one of our guys in the back has seen it. How many of you have seen the video, It's Not About the Nail?
Oh,
this is my all-time favorite video now using for this kind of training.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's gonna stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever gonna stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
No, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See,
out.
you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like, there's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. If you would just...
Don't.
Try to see things my way. Do I have to keep on talking till I can go?
Yeah, I think it's the training I got from Bruce and looking at this video really did save my marriage, because I could see myself so much in that guy's position doing that. And it often happens when we do these disclosure scenarios. People want to go in and want to fix it. instead of just listening and really soaking it in and seeing how they're feeling and validating their emotions. And it's very difficult, but through the training and the rest of it, particularly with super communicators giving coaching, you can actually do that. So instead of the unkind cascade, what we view this as the cascade of candor kindness. That when we do lean in instead of lean out, when we do create these kind moments with fellow physicians and nurses and pharmacists and administrators and other people and our patients, it has a huge cascade with a big impact on both the families as well as the entire care team in a way that we really believe these connections and this kindness has a huge impact on everybody in many, many different ways. And now there's a lot of data to show how with candor being the antidote to deny and defend, you can make a huge difference throughout the organization, huge difference with burnout, and a huge difference with the actual health of the people involved in this. So there's this amazing article that just came out in 2016 and another one that blew me away. I did not realize the impact of these social connections as well as kindness. I did not realize they're actually predictors of mortality. In fact, a greater predictor of mortality than body mass index and other things. In fact, one of the questions, if you answer in the affirmative, puts you at a higher lifespan than those who don't have this, is thinking very seriously to yourself, do you have somebody who you could call with a horrible, horrible thing happening to you at 4 o'clock in the morning? Those who are isolated and don't have that have a much higher mortality rate than those who do. It's really staggering to see the research that's come out recently on this. So the physiologic impact of us being kind to each other, having a care for the caregiver program, loving families through this stuff, it increases oxytocin, lowers blood pressure, increases serotonin, improves immune response, all the way down to decreased mortality rate. And again, study that just came out in September blew my mind. They knew in 4 weeks they were going to be doing immunizations on everybody in the organization. For 4 weeks, they studied the mood, the level of burnout of all of those before they got the shot and afterwards. And the one thing that predicted the best immune response was the mood, the sense of connection, the sense of kindness. It's amazing to see what they were able to see. Those people feeling very burned out had a far less high immune response just related to these vaccines. So this has a huge potential impact that goes way beyond the things we've looked at in terms of our liability outcomes and other stuff related to that. So just real quickly here, one of the things that we had a challenge when we've gone to these hospitals is how do we sell this to the medical staff? And overwhelmingly, it's the Care for the Caregiver program that really gets the medical staff to lean in. So here's just a 90-second video kind of driving that home.
I'm an orthopedic surgeon, and hearing the program and just the whole system approach of how to deal with catastrophic events, I thought was a really compelling message. The way we've been doing this is all wrong. The most compelling thing that has sort of kicked it off is the Care for the Caregiver program. We don't have anything like that, particularly for physicians, police departments, and aircraft. I mean, every other industry does it. So why are we so different? But you know, we're supposed to be tougher than that. But we're not. Apart from all of the early disclosure and all the rest of it, which I think is also very important, there has been such a lack of the peer support part of it. So training's been enthusiastic at the faculty level, enthusiastic I think at the participant level as well. I've heard a number of these speakers before, and you would think that having heard some of them before that maybe you would lose interest, but in point of fact, it's done in a different manner, and it's as compelling the second time around because you glean more information, and we have really good audience participation, so I can't speak more highly of it. You know, I'll take advantage of every symposium that comes along because I think it's a really worthwhile education.
Yeah, so he was chief of staff at John Muir Hospital in California, a huge believer implementing this. So what about the other data? So we just published our work at the end of December in Health Services Research, 13 years of data, 5 years before, 8 years after, showing that event reporting increased, like I talked about resident physicians, strong process improvements, and reductions in serious safety events, claims decrease, liability costs decrease, balance in self-insurance fund went up. All this was really great data. I know Michelle's going to talk about it later today. Important from the care for the caregiver standpoint, the time to resolution continued to decrease, which is huge. You know, when we started this, it was 5 years from event till full resolution. It was under a year by the time we were done doing this. So that is a whole lot less work, a whole lot less money spent, and a whole lot less suffering related to that. And we also published in a whole separate paper the decrease in defensive medicine related to this. So in concluding, Candor benefits your conscience and your cardiovascular system. It keeps patients and families from getting burned and keeps clinicians from burning out. It is good for you and your patients, and as you saw in the early video, especially for Jack and Teresa Gentry. So we'll finish there. I think it's time that we go to our break. Great.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.